We knew because of the unprecedented early vote and the mail-in vote that it was going to take a while. We're going to have to be patient until the hard work of tallying the votes is finished. And it ain't over till every vote is counted, every ballot is counted.
This is a major fraud in our nation. We want the law to be used in a proper manner. So we'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop.
The race to the White House is far from over. The polls closed long ago. Now we're entering a new phase. Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. Welcome to a special edition of the France 24 debate. We knew it would come down to this. That is to say, the day after the polls, more ballot counting, particularly since we've had record early voting for this election. But it's contentious. And the longer it goes on, the more the lawyers from both sides get involved. All these states where they're still counting ballots, like Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, and Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, where we begin our coverage with France 24's Florence Villeminot in Philadelphia. What's the latest there?
Hey, Francois. Well, the voting count continues here in Pennsylvania. About 80% of the ballots have been counted so far. President Donald Trump is in the lead by about 500,000 votes here, but be patient because about 1.1 million absentee ballots are still outstanding. And so far, this could really be a game changer because so far Joe Biden has won absentee ballots here in Pennsylvania by an overwhelming margin. According to data from the Secretary of State, he's won about 80% of these absentee ballots, and a lot of them still have to be counted. So basically, if he continues to win these absentee ballots that are still being counted by that margin, he could carry the state here. Now, every vote needs to be counted, but we just heard there Donald Trump, he wants the counting to stop. He's vowed to go to the Supreme Court on this issue. He has said they're working hard to make our 500,000 lead advantage disappear. It's a very different story, though, when you hear election officials here in Pennsylvania. They're saying, other than the unprecedented nature of the mail-in ballots, this is a normal election. Otherwise, they're going to take the time it takes to count every vote to make sure this is a fair election. We've been at the Pennsylvania Convention Center. That is where the ballots from Philadelphia are being counted, and it is a laborious operation, according to election officials we spoke to there. They likened it to an assembly line, and that's because there were so many of these mail-in and absentee ballots because of the unprecedented nature of this election during the coronavirus pandemic. 2.5 million absentee and mail-in ballots in total out of the 9 million voters that you have here in Pennsylvania. And physically, it takes a lot of time to count those ballots, and that's why it's taking such a long time. They told us how it works here at the Pennsylvania Convention Center. Basically, they have to open the envelopes because there's several envelopes. Your ballot is put in a secrecy envelope, and that envelope is put in a declaration envelope. So 2 envelopes need to be opened. The ballot needs to be smoothed out and manually fed into a machine that counts the ballots. They can count them pretty quickly, 10,000 an hour when the machines are up and running, but it takes time. We have to be patient. All across the state, you're hearing calls for patience. The governor, Tom Wolf, the mayor of Philadelphia, Jim Kinney, calling for patience, calling for calm, calling for unity as these votes are counted.
Yeah, and perhaps a foretaste of what may happen your way, Florence Villeminot. What with the state of Wisconsin, Joe Biden provisionally seems to have eked out a razor-thin win. The Trump campaign quick to demand a recount. Are you getting a sense that the fight is only beginning where you are?
Absolutely, Francois. Some people are saying that Pennsylvania could become the new Florida when it comes to this kind of litigation over election results here. Another thing you need to keep in mind about Pennsylvania, and we've been talking about this before Election Day, is that Pennsylvania decided to extend the deadline for counting this overwhelming number of mail-in and absentee ballots. Basically, any mail-in ballot that is post-stamped before or on November 3rd, they have until November 6th. So that is Friday to count those ballots. So that is 3 extra days. Keep in mind that Republicans already challenged this extension of the deadline. It already went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided not to weigh in, not to overturn this extension of the deadline. Why? Because the Supreme Court actually deadlocked on the issue. The new Justice, Amy Coney Barrett, she decided not to weigh in on it, to stay out of it because she basically hadn't read up enough about it, wasn't quite ready to weigh in on it. So for now, this extension has been allowed, but keep in mind all the votes that are being counted between November 3rd and November 6th, so that 3-day deadline, all the extra votes there are being tallied separately in case they are eventually invalidated, which could happen. The voting officials we spoke to at the Pennsylvania Convention Center said it's really important not to mix those votes up with the other ones, because once they're mixed up, you can't unmix them. So they're going to tally them separately in case those votes are challenged by Republicans, which the Republican Party has already said it's ready to do. So in all likelihood, they're going to challenge that. So it could be several days before we have the final result here in Pennsylvania.
Florence Villeminot live in Philadelphia. And yeah, it was a little after 2 a.m. in the White House that Donald Trump appealed to the Supreme Court, crying foul before, again, millions of ballots had yet to be counted in this U.S. presidential election that spans so many time zones. For more, let's cross to the suburbs of Washington, D.C. and Tacoma Park, Maryland. Congressman Jamie Raskin, a Democrat, joins us. Thank you for being with us here on France 24, or should I say, congratulations, since you won re-election this Tuesday.
Well, I appreciate that very much, and I'm delighted to be with you and your viewers.
First question for you. When you look at the numbers now and how close it's been, Donald Trump is right on one thing. The pollsters got it wrong again. We all thought that Trump had maxed out his possibility for getting new constituents, broadening his base. And yet, with this record turnout in so many places, he too got more votes. How do you explain it?
Well, I mean, you're talking to a politician who doesn't use pollsters, and I've always been a great skeptic of polling as an industry, and it's become especially suspect now because the vast majority of people don't have phones at home, so they use their cell phones, and a lot of people don't answer the call for pollsters, and they don't want to respond to pollsters. So you can imagine how that would be true of a lot of Trump supporters. So that's one possible explanation of what's going on. But the other, of course, is simply that the full force of the Biden vote, what we call the big blue wave, has not come in yet because so many Democrats decided to vote by mail because Democrats have been much more likely to follow the COVID-19 precautions, whereas Donald Trump was telling his supporters not to trust vote by mail and to go and vote on Election Day. So it may very well be that the so-called red mirage begins to dissipate and flow away, and the big blue wave comes rolling in Wisconsin and Michigan and North Carolina, even in Arizona, as the mail-in ballots are counted.
And you could say that this is almost at the core of Donald Trump's strategy. He's been warning us all along that if we wait too long for the results, it's going to seem fishy. He cried foul overnight. The longer it goes on, the harder it is. At what point do you say that we're in a constitutional crisis?
No, all of that is propaganda and disinformation. There is not a single state in the United States of America that has a law that cuts off the counting of ballots at midnight on Election Day. There's no Cinderella law for the counting of ballots. Every state has a law that all ballots must be counted regardless of when they were cast. And so when President Trump says, let's just stop the voting, and there are 22 million votes that haven't been counted yet, he's not talking about stopping voting. He's talking about stopping the counting of ballots. And that obviously is an outrageous assault on democracy itself. And, you know, we know that has been his strategy all along to get his people to vote on Election Day. Then Republicans blocked voting changes that would have allowed for early votes and for mail-in ballots to be counted earlier. In other words, they insisted that they be counted later, and now they're insisting that they not be counted at all. I think everyone can see that for the fraudulent pretense that it is.
And how you work with Republicans every day when you're on Capitol Hill, how resolute is the other side, you think?
Well, I mean, this is the great disappointment for those of us who believed in some traditions of bipartisanship. I mean, one thing that we thought that everybody in America agreed to was that we had to have a fair election process. I mean, in the year 2000, Vice President Gore was actually presiding over the counting of the electoral votes in the joint session of Congress in January, and he presided over the casting of electors that made him lose the election. Even though it was very suspect, he stuck to it. And here we have a situation where the president is trying to stop the counting of tens of millions of ballots in the United States. And I'm afraid that a lot of our Republican colleagues in Congress are no longer acting like members of a political party. They're acting like members of a religious cult. They will go along with anything Donald Trump says. If Donald Trump is attacking people wearing masks and he says, don't wear masks and we'll just inject everybody with bleach, they don't utter a peep of protest. They go along with that. If Donald Trump had said, everybody must wear a mask, this is a patriot mask, and people who don't wear them are traitors to our country, they would be beating up people for not wearing masks. So they have suspended all critical thought at this point.
And if this was any other time except for this election, of course, the top story of the day would be the COVID surge. One of the surprises when you look at the voting numbers, in some of those areas where people were hard hit by COVID, they still voted for Donald Trump. How do you explain that?
Well, you know, propaganda has a very powerful impact on people. If you are fed a constant diet of lies and disinformation on Fox News, and that's all you watch, then you have no idea that America leads the world in COVID-19 death count. You have no idea that America leads the world in COVID-19 case count. And you have no idea that you're being fed disinformation and propaganda. And so they conduct rallies at the White House. They conduct rallies out in different parts of America, in Oklahoma, in Florida, where the majority of people are not wearing masks. They are not socially distanced. And people don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's hard to explain that level of derangement in the followers of the president, but that is what has become. And we just have to stand very strong for science, for facts, and for the mechanisms of constitutional democracy. We must be constitutional patriots here. So everybody who is saying, let's count the ballots, let's see the state election systems through, those are the people who are being constitutional patriots. And that's where I am right now. I feel very strongly we must stand by the popular vote, and we must stand by the popular vote as it translates through our complicated electoral college system.
Congressman Raskin, one final question for you. You're a constitutional scholar yourself. It's really tough for us at France 24 sometimes to explain the arcaneness of this voting system, of the electoral college, this 240-year-old system you have in the United States. Is changing that system any time in the cards, or is that just a utopia?
Well, It is an antiquated system, and it really is an obsolete system in some ways. In this election, we have to stand by it, and we have to make sure that we are scrupulously observing the provisions of the Electoral College. Those are the rules of this game. Having said that, the very first bill that I introduced as a state senator in Maryland was to supersede this system, essentially to leave it behind, and I introduced a bill that's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And this is a way to get us out of all of the problems of the Electoral College. Essentially, we're creating a network of states who say that they are willing to cast their elector not for the winner in their state, but for the winner of the national vote. And we need 270 electors to be represented by states in the coalition before it's activated. Right now, we are just around 200, so we are a majority of the way there, but we haven't gotten there yet. So it is not operative in this election. But let's hope by the next election, the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact comes into existence or force. I don't think we're going to be able to amend the Constitution to change the system until the states do it first. And that's really how most of our great constitutional changes have taken place, like women's suffrage in the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, whose centennial anniversary we observed this year. That followed upon a situation where dozens of states had just given women the right to vote, and then finally Congress followed along to ratify that by saying, let's pass a constitutional amendment. But it's difficult to do a constitutional amendment because it takes 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and then 3/4 of all the states to ratify it.
It's a heavy lift. Congressman Jamie Raskin, so many thanks for welcoming us to your home in Tacoma Park, Maryland. And best of luck now with the fights that are only beginning surrounding this election, which again, as we say, is far from over. For more, let's cross to another politician who's a former congressman, also from the Washington, D.C. area, from Virginia. Tom Davis, thank you so much for speaking with us here on France 24. You heard Congressman Raskin there saying that it's an antiquated system you have as we count these ballots and the tension mounts, but for now we got to stick with it. You agree?
Well, I don't think we have any alternative. You know, Congress in the 1960s did try to amend the Constitution, but you need 38 states to ratify it, and that's just not in the cards at this point. So this is the system we have. The other part of it is every state has different election laws. Can you imagine a national election where one state allows felons, another state has voter ID, and another doesn't, where you have different rules for absentee ballots? You'd have to nationalize this and take it away from the states, and I think that states are reluctant to do that.
How's it going so far, do you think? I mean, we heard that statement from the U.S. president crying fraud. Since then, the ballot counting has continued. How do you have a sense on this day after Election Day that the entire process is going?
Well, I think it's moving along. Let me just make a couple differing views from my friend Jamie Raskin. First of all, you've got to remember that in Pennsylvania, the state Supreme Court, which is elected and is a Democratic Supreme Court, unilaterally changed the rules that the state statute had. They had the ability to do that as the governing court in the land, and the Supreme Court did not hear it at this time, but it can be reheard after the election. But they unilaterally changed the rules so that ballots that didn't arrive by Tuesday could still be counted if they showed up by Wednesday. They changed some of the other rules on absentee balloting and access that never went through the legislature or were to put into law. So you have a pretty partisan state Supreme Court in this, and I think when Republicans cry foul, I think they're looking at that. There's no evidence that I can see that in the count at this point anybody is miscounting the votes. There are a lot of eyes on this, and I think we're just going to have to wait and see what happens.
The U.S. president accused of lobbing hand grenades into the system, figuratively speaking, of course, when he constantly cries foul, when he says we're going to the courts while they're still counting ballots on election night. Does Donald Trump go too far?
Well, I think you get a lot of rhetoric in elections on all sides that sometimes go a little bit overboard. But if you listen to his campaign at this point, they're all saying this is a close race. We need to see these ballots counted. He's certainly within his rights under the state laws to ask for recounts in some of these states. He's going to be within his legal rights to go after and challenge certain ballots if they don't meet the procedural safeguards that are put in them by law. In other words, if they're not signed, if the signatures don't match, if there's evidence that somebody else delivered the ballot, and you may see ballots challenged one-on-one. I'm reminded the Democrats in the year 2000 at one point filed a lawsuit in Florida to throw out all military ballots. So when power is at stake, funny things happen along the way, and I wouldn't be surprised at this point that whoever comes up short doesn't use everything legally available to them. But basically, counting of the ballots is state law. It's not federal law. And to get that to a federal court, you have to raise some federal question. And that's more difficult to do, particularly when you read Bush versus Gore, where the court on a 5-4 decision decided that to stop the recount in Florida. They said that case was basically sui generis. It was very unique in this, and it wasn't to be used as precedent.
Bush versus Gore, just to remind our viewers, it's year 2000. Effectively, the U.S. Supreme Court announces after weeks of legal wrangling, the whole world watching, to stop the recount. George W. Bush declared the winner in that election because of getting the electoral votes in Florida. And there's still a sense that it could be Florida on steroids this time around, what with uncertainty in so many states. And again, is there any way to shorten the process?
Well, look, I think the process was lengthened in this case by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, that instead of taking a look at ballots that arrived by Election Day, decided to artificially extend it until the end of the week, giving people 3-4 more days. You've got to remember on absentee ballots, there is something called harvesting ballots where people go out and collect them. Bounties are sometimes paid. It's not a common practice, but I've seen it utilized in some states. There's always some suspicion about this. That doesn't mean the ballots were cast incorrectly or that anybody cheated per se, but there's always been a higher suspicion in some of these states that tends to work to the Democrats' advantage. In this particular case, I think Jamie Raskin got it right, that Trump kind of talked down to his voters. He said, don't cast these votes by mail. It's not going to work. And so the mail ballots are basically not Trump supporters. For the most part, they tend to be overwhelmingly Democratic. They just happen to be coming in very late. So it gives the illusion at this point that maybe things are rigged a little bit. And there will be a number of these ballots that do not meet the procedural safeguards that the law allows, and they will be challenged. So we'll just have to wait and see when it's all over if there are enough late ballots coming in to put Joe Biden over the top or not in the key states.
Tom Davis, one final question for you. This is a very different Republican Party from when you entered Congress back in 1995. Is there a sense that if Donald Trump loses, that it will still be Donald Trump's party, or can it revert back to being the party of fiscal belt tightening and defense hawks and perhaps a more civil tone in the United States?
Well, let me add, I think both parties are very different. There's no question that Donald Trump recognized that the Republican base was moving from the country club to the country, that it was becoming more rural-based, more blue-collar based, more non-college educated, that he was attracting a new group of people to the party that had been moving in that direction for some time, but he hastened that. He kind of put an exclamation point on that. But the Democratic Party's been changing too. The challenge for Joe Biden will be he has been elected by a coalition that is very dissonant in its goals. And how, when you have to start making choices as a leader, do you start choosing between competing parts? So both parties are kind of in transitional periods. Whether Donald Trump arrives or not, I think, and stays the titular head of the party, I think will be a debate within the party over the next 4 years should he lose this election. And it's hard to say where this goes.
Hard to say where it goes. Congressman, Tom Davis. I want to thank you so much, former Congressman Tom Davis from Virginia, for joining us here on France 24. And again, there's still a lot of uncertainty in the air as we continue to count those ballots on this day after Election Day here on France 24. One of those states where we know we won't get any definitive results before at Thursday at the earliest is Arizona. France 24 correspondent Elisa Caberly is there. Elisa, what's the latest?
That's right. I'm in front of the Maricopa County Election Center where they are continuing to count votes today. Now, the AP has officially called the state of Arizona for Joe Biden because Maricopa County, which holds about 60% of the population here in Arizona, has such a wide margin between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. So they are assuming that because that margin is so wide, that this state will go to Joe Biden. But they're still counting votes. 250,000 mail-in votes, which typically lean toward Democrat, are still being counted today. Those came in Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. And they also have, so they can count about 6,000 to 8,000 votes per hour. So they're getting through those very quickly. But the thing that slows them down is the fact that it takes a long time to verify the signature. It takes a long time to open the actual mail-in ballots. But then once they have them open, they can process those pretty quickly. Now, they also are waiting on ballots that came in, mail-in ballots, that came in yesterday on Election Day. They will know a little bit more of the number of mail-in ballots by about 7 p.m. local time today. So we are still counting ballots here in Arizona. AP, like I said, has officially called it for Joe Biden. But again, President Trump is making it very clear that he does not want to call any states, especially Arizona, since that did go to him 4 years ago. And this would be a flip state if Joe Biden were to officially win after all of the votes are counted.
And whoever the next president is, he'll need to, if he wants to reform, have some backup in Congress. How is the Senate looking where you are?
That's right. They have also officially called the Senate for Mark Kelly. Now, he was up against Martha McSweeney to fill the John McCain seat when John McCain died 2 years ago in 2018. So the Senate looks like it is going to turn completely blue here in Arizona. Again, we still want to make sure that we count all of these ballots, and we don't want to prematurely say anything, but the margins are very hot, very disparate between Mark Kelly and Martha McSally, and it looks like Mark Kelly, former NASA astronaut and husband to Congresswoman or former Congresswoman Gabby Gifford, who was shot in the face a few years ago, and has since recovered. It looks like he is going to take the Senate, and that is also a big deal here in Arizona. It is the first time in decades that they will have two Democratic senators in this state.
Elisa Caberly reporting live there from Phoenix, Arizona, and I want to thank you so much for that update. Now, for more, we can turn now to Saba Chibaka, who is a student at the University of Maryland, and you're a member of a group called Black Terps Matter. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24. What does Black Terps Matter mean?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So Black Terps Matter. Terps is short for Terrapins, which is the mascot at the University of Maryland. Black Terps Matter specifically is an anti-racist coalition that started on June 25th at the University of Maryland, specifically to get justice for Lieutenant Richard Collins III, who is a black student from Bowie State University that was murdered by a white supremacist on our campus.
It's interesting when we look at some of the exit polls from Tuesday. Obviously, the protests that we saw all summer calling for police reform. You can hear perhaps behind me there downstairs from where we are, across from the White House. There are Black Lives Matter protesters. But voters didn't rate that as the top issue or one of the two top issues in their decision for who they cast a ballot. How much has Black Lives Matter, from what these early results show, impacted the final result?
So really, the point of Black Black Lives Matter and Black Terps Matter as well. And impacting the election is reminding people that this is not actually just one person that we need to vote out. This is actually the issue is the system of white supremacy that is inside of so many of our different institutions. In the education system, which I'm most familiar with as a student at a university, but it's also inside of the politics. It's also inside of the social services and inside of the policing institutions as well. So Black Lives Matter has really reminded people that in addition to needing to vote certain people out because they are indeed racist, it's kind of more of a holistic view that this is something that we need to work on in every aspect of our lives.
Have you personally changed in your way you approach civics and politics since the death of George Floyd, that black man who was killed at the hands of Minneapolis police back during the summer?
Yeah, absolutely. The death of George Floyd really made me have a new perspective on how I was going to go about resisting in my everyday life. Anyone that knows me knows that I have literally been protesting on the front lines for more than 150 days now. And so that is a shift in my regular life as a student. I'm used to going to classes. Well, now all my classes are online, but I'm used to doing that, working. I've interned at the U.S. Department of Treasury. I've interned at Google in Ann Arbor, Michigan. But now that we are in the midst of the movement, a social movement, it has it really reminds me that we have an obligation as people, not as Black people, not as Democrats or anything of the such, but as people to use our moral compass to guide us in these situations, to know that something is wrong. And so surprisingly, now I think we're realizing that people are actually talking less about the Black Lives Matter movement. The people that are actually carrying the movement is the opposition. It is the white supremacists, and which is very interesting, something that I didn't see coming. But at the end of the day, we need to remain in the headlines. We need to remain in the newspapers. So it's looking like if it's not us talking about it, it's the people that hate us, which I'm not mad at.
Well, on that point, when we've been driving around, we've seen on the front lawns of the affluent suburbs of Washington, D.C., Black Lives Matter signs competing with signs supporting the candidates. Most instances, it's the Biden side. What's your thought when you see those Black Lives Matter signs in stores on people's front lawns?
Well, when I see the Black Lives Matter sign, it reminds me of compassion. Being a part of this Black Lives Matter movement is completely a choice. It's a choice. It's optional for a lot of people. A lot of people, including Black people in America, are choosing not to incorporate themselves into this movement. Now, I always say it's a lot of people do the same thing for different reasons. And so I think that kind of goes into the Black Lives Matter movement, because I know that the reason that I'm out here is specifically for the future generations of kids. The thing that I care most about is getting Black students into colleges. And that's why I participated in a sit-in just 2 weeks ago called hashtag Tent City 2020, and it was centering Black education. We actually slept outside of the Department of Education in Washington, D.C. for 8 days, 7 nights. But other people will incorporate themselves into the Black Lives Matter movement for issues like things about gun reform and gun violence awareness, substance abuse, these things that actually do impact Black people at a greater rate. So it really reminds me that people can be compassionate if they choose to, but if they choose not to, that's a personal issue between them and their God or whoever, whatever it is they choose to believe in.
For joining us, Saba Chibaka, activist with Black Terps Matter. Good luck with your studies at the University of Maryland, and like I suppose you and everyone else, we're all waiting for those results. Let's hope it goes whichever way that you want. At this point in time, We're joined by France 24 correspondent Ketevan Gorjestani. Ketevan, is this playing out the way you thought it would, this election?
I mean, we all knew that it was going to take some time to count the votes. I think a lot of people were going with what we saw in the polls, and the polls, again, were very wrong. And I think, once again, if you look at back in 2016, the polls got it the most wrong in the Midwest, and it seems like that happened again this time around, because the average polling, even just a few days ago, in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, had Joe Biden up by 8-9 points, and we're seeing how close it is still, just a few thousand votes there. And so I think there's going to be a question about that polling, but the numbers were all pointing in the direction of Biden, and we see that Donald Trump actually turned things around in that sense.
He turned things around, and what's surprising is I spoke to one political strategist who said to me earlier that people are suffering. And it's in areas hard hit by COVID, they still voted for Donald Trump. They see the Democratic Party as the party of the establishment. Again, it's kind of the conversation we had earlier about how what was the traditional left and right in the United States, it sort of turned on its head.
Yes, and I think there were also we might have read too much in a few things that we thought were going to go in the favor of Joe Biden. You mentioned COVID-19.
Yeah, we said COVID, oh, that's it. Donald Trump is out. There's no way he can rebound from this. But then people were saying to me, hey, if the Democratic Party is the party of shutting down the economy, I'm worried about that.
That's exactly right. And so a lot of people thought that because COVID-19 and not the economy was the thing number one on people's minds, that they were necessarily going to vote for Joe Biden. And it turned out, to, as you said, that people were seeing COVID as the most important, but their analysis as to what to do with it did not necessarily lean into Joe Biden, and actually they went some for Donald Trump. The same can be said with the question of turnout. We were all looking at these turnout numbers thinking, this is, like tradition goes, going to favor Democrats, and we saw that the turnout came also in favor of Donald Trump. We were talking about his base, and his base got expanded.
We thought he'd maxed out his constituency, and we see in places like Florida where he picked up a sizable number of new Latino voters. It's early days, right, to be analyzing all of this, but it is a surprise.
Yes, the demographics are going to be extremely interesting to see see what is happening. You mentioned the Latinos in Florida. It's going to be interesting to see what happened with the seniors in Florida, because Joe Biden looked like he had a big lead among seniors. Will that hold true? We're going to see also how Joe Biden did with turning out African Americans. Did he manage to come back to those Barack Obama numbers, or was he closer to Hillary Clinton? Those demographics will be very interesting to analyze and see where the Democrats failed to bring out those numbers.
Yeah, where they failed to bring out those numbers. Another one is it's early days at this point. How did we're all wondering, how did Donald Trump and how did Joe Biden do with women voters? Because everyone said, oh, the women are deserting Donald Trump for Joe Biden. We don't quite know what the result of that is either.
No, and that has to do a lot also with 2018 and the numbers we saw, and the blue wave we saw in the House in 2018. That was largely led by women in the suburbs. And so there was a feeling that that was going to carry over to the presidential elections, and we'll see if that was actually true. The polls said it was true, but we'll have to wait to see the breakdown and how many of those women, of those college-educated women in the suburbs, actually did, in fact, desert Donald Trump in the end or not.
All right, let's look ahead a little bit, Ketevan. Both sides say they're well lawyered up for what lies ahead. We didn't see the civil war that some had predicted on election night. There's a few protests I can see back there, but things are generally pretty calm in Washington so far. Again, it's that question of the longer it drags out, and we've had a more toxic political atmosphere than ever before in the United States, or ever since, I guess, the Vietnam War. You wonder how much of this can people take?
Well, people were sort of expecting this to be problematic. They didn't know how long it would be taking. But first, we're going to have possible recounts. That's going to be probably the first step. The automatic recounts in certain states under a certain threshold, they just decide to recount. So we're going to have to wait for that. And then there's, of course, what Donald Trump said about going to the Supreme Court. The question is, on what basis will he take that to the Supreme Court? What legal basis? What is he going to claim to throw out some of those numbers? And there's one thing to remember. Back in 2000 with the Florida situation, back then they threw out some of those recounts because the Democrats were sort of saying, well, we're going to do a recount there this way, the other county we're going to recount another way. And that's what you're seeing the Republicans sort of saying. They want to recount in the Midwest. They want to stop the count in the Midwest. They don't really want to stop it in places like Nevada and Arizona. And that could be tricky because if you're asking for the same thing all across the board, it's easier to get your case across. If you start picking only the counties where you're doing well, then it looks a little bit different.
Stay with us, Kedevan Gorjestani, because we're going to go over now. We're going to go over to we're going to go over to Leo Michel, who is former senior official at the Defense Department, former official at the CIA. He is now senior fellow, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24. Earlier we had Democrats and Republicans telling us we're not in a constitutional crisis at this point. This is the usual power play that takes place in any U.S. presidential election. Nonetheless, we heard Donald Trump cry foul while the ballots were still being counted on election night. Do you agree that it's not a constitutional crisis?
It doesn't appear to be yet, but I would have to say personally that the president has surprised many people by his actions and has not always been restrained, perhaps by cooler heads in the White House and in his administration. So while my field of specialty is more in defense and international affairs, that also will be affected, I think, in important ways by the outcome of this election.
This is a U.S. president that for the last 4 years has taken a lot of shots at the civil service, talking about draining the swamp, undermining his top generals at times, undermining his own cabinet, and not filling positions, undermining the CIA itself. Can that relationship between the executive and the high civil service in the United States be easily repaired? Will it all be forgotten if Joe Biden's elected?
Well, perhaps not forgotten in the sense that it's an object lesson of what happens when the president is actually not acquainted by his own experience with the levers of government. And here I would just add a few examples. As far as the intelligence community is concerned, this problematic relations he has had actually goes back to weeks before his inauguration, when the outgoing administration released a public report detailing the Russian intervention in the elections of November 2016, and actually formally stating that it was the Russian president who authorized this interference to take vengeance upon Hillary Clinton and to favor the election of Donald Trump. And I think it seems to me that Mr. Trump has never forgiven the intelligence agencies for doing what he thought was casting doubt on the integrity of his election. There have been numerous incidents since then. The two that stand out in my mind is his joint press conference in 2018 with President Putin, where he seemed very obviously to take the side or take the word of Mr. Putin that there had not been interference in the U.S. elections, directly contradicting the repeated affirmations, frankly, of his own directors of the intelligence agencies. And then even more recently, last year, there was an anonymous CIA officer who filed a whistleblower report on the president's conversations and pressure put on his Ukrainian counterpart. And the president, using tweet, of course, implied, in fact, stated, I think, more than once boldly, that this anonymous CIA officer was a traitor, and the president and his son sought to unmask this individual. A very clear example of intimidation.
Leo Michel, of Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, thank you so much for joining us here in the France 24 debate. One final quick word from you, Ketevan. We've just been talking about all of the issues that Donald Trump has had with his own administration. When we look ahead now at this battle royale that's unfolding, this giant power play between the Democrats and the Republicans, how are U.S. institutions holding up so far?
It's hard to tell, because there have been a lot of attacks on U.S. institutions. So far, they've managed to hold on. The question is, we'll see what happens with this election. I think is going to be the real litmus test.
And we're still waiting for those final results to come in from many of those key battleground states. There's much more coverage on France 24 and France24.com. Thanks very much, Ketevan Gorgestani. I want to thank you for joining us here for this special edition of the France 24 debate.